Hi, today we're doing Module 61, the conservation of biodiversity. So let's first start talking about the condor. It is a species of success. It's a super cool bird that has a wingspan of 10 feet, which is the width of a bus. Its numbers were down to 22 individuals, um, and in the 80s we started protecting it. It needed to go into protection because it is a bird that eats carrion, and carrion is dead carcasses, and people hunt dead carcasses. And so when these birds would uh, go and consume these large carcasses, they would also get the lead shot, and so they were getting sick with lead poisoning and dying off. And so we have brought those numbers up with the conservation of these birds. We have brought the numbers up into 400, so there's about 200 in the wild and 200 in captivity. There is a here's a pretty cool, a pretty interesting video about them. And here is a live condor cam where if you go here, you can see little baby condors in the nest. So pretty adorable. Another cool fact about condors is that they can fly the distance of, of from New York City to Washington, D.C. in one day, which is really interesting. So first we're going to talk about ways that we protect individual species. And one way that we protect individual species is the Mammal Protection Act. The Mammal Protection Act is put in place to prohibit the sales of any marine mammals or their body parts. So you can't sell or buy any marine mammals. And so examples of this would be like whale meat and would be like walrus ivory tusks. And so we focus on specific animals like polar bears, sea otters, manatees. And then they work with the Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and with NOAA, and to put land into conservation and to protect these animals. The next thing that we're going to talk about is the Endangered Species Act of 1973. This has protected endangered, threatened, and endangered species, and gives the authority to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife to identify which species are going to be threatened and endangered. And so to prevent any sort of confusion, the IUCN, which we talked about a few days ago, identifies threatened or near threatened species. So near threatened is a little bit less severe than the threatened, and so threatened is the most threatened level and in most danger. And so the Fish and Wildlife uses a little bit different terminology. So endangered is the most threatened or in danger of going into extinction within the foreseeable future, whereas their word threatened is a little bit less severe. And the CITES works with the U.S. government to help purchase land for conservation. And protecting land is an important part of conservation because when you conserve the land, you are providing habitat and food and niches for the species, and all of those things are necessary for life. And so an example of this would be the Sifaka lemur in Madagascar. The Sifaka lemur lives specifically in very dry areas of the country, and in only this country. And at one point they found gold and started mining, and the mining efforts was deteriorating the quality of the land and we were starting to see the decline in Sifaka lemurs. And so by putting these animals into protection or labeling them as endangered, the mining had to stop, and now the Sifaka lemurs can start to see rises in numbers. So the Endangered Species Act has put 227 invertebrates on the list, 394 vertebrates, 815 plants, and an additional 245 species are being considered. Not all species on the list go extinct, so there is good news. We have stories of success like the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, the American alligator, and the eastern Pacific gray whale, just to name a few. So we can be hopeful. And while the Endangered Species Act does do a lot of good, there are people that are affected negatively by this. And if you remember, we talked about the spotted owl in the northwestern United States in the boreal forest. There's large vasts of land that have gone into protection to preserve the spotted owl. But because of this, there are many logging projects that had to be stopped. And there are a lot of people out there, and not a lot of industry. And so there's a lot of people that are counting on those logging projects, and they have less work. And so you have to understand that people getting frustrated because they're having a hard time feeding their family. And so you can see here that there's a little bit of vengeance towards the spotted owl or towards the Endangered Species Act. And so our next effort on protecting specific species is the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is an international treaty with 3 objectives. The first is to conserve biodiversity. The second is sustainably use biodiversity. And the third is to share the commercial use of genetic resources for pharmaceutical drugs. If you remember correctly, we talked about specific species like the rosy periwinkle. That was a little pink flower found in Madagascar that was found to fight Hodgkin's lymphoma and childhood leukemia. And so there's going to be a commercial benefit to the pharmaceutical industry and to countries for that. And so that should be shared equitably. And so if you can see here, this is a map of the countries. The green is the countries that that partake in the treaty. And the purple, United States, are the countries that have signed but not ratified. And there are a couple of little orange dots in this part of the world that you can't see because the map is a little bit too small. And so the Convention on Biological Diversity started an assessment in 1992 and went to 210, and the following was established. On average, species at risk of extinction have moved closer to extinction. 1/4 of all plant species are still threatened with extinction. Natural habitats are becoming smaller and more fragmented. While genetic diversity of crops and livestock is declining, there is a widespread loss of ecosystem function. The causes of biodiversity loss have either stayed the same or increased in intensity. The ecological footprint of humans has increased. And so not an overall good trend, but hopefully in the next 20 years we can see a more successful trend. And so conservation efforts that don't necessarily focus on a single species but on ecosystems are ways that we can put land into conservation. And so if you can see, in 1900 we didn't have a lot of land in protection, and as time progressed we see the value of biodiversity and have been putting more and more land into conservation. And so we work hard to protect ecosystems, and when we do this, certain questions arise. So how large should the designated area be? So if we think about certain species like black bears, just one single male requires 5 to 10 square miles. And so if you have just one black bear, that isn't necessarily a viable population. And so this is going to dictate how much land we need to put into conservation. And should we put just a single large area, or should we have several small areas? Can protected area be isolated? So can you have like a town forest, which is surrounded by developed areas? And if it is an island or a single small area, how far should it be from another protected area? What species can move from one protected area to the next? Bird species might be able to use multiple town forests, whereas small rodents might be confined to just a single area. And so we have to take into consideration island biogeography. We're going to get into this in Chapter 6, so we won't go too in depth here. And so larger islands support larger populations, and more diverse populations. And this is because it offers more room, which makes sense. And when you have more room, you have more niches, you have more types of food. And so these larger islands are less susceptible to extinctions. And so I have pictures of literal islands here, and sometimes we're talking about literal islands surrounded by water. But you can have single ponds. So amphibians are going to be able to migrate from one pond to the next. And so if you have ponds close together, they're going to be able to use multiple ponds unless they're too far apart. And so you have mountaintops. These are also considered islands of biodiversity. And we talked about forested areas and their islands because they are surrounded by developed areas. And so these are all things that we need to take into consideration. And so when we look at this, the debate, we call it SLOS, single large or several small. And both of these ideas, single large or several small, have merits. They both have upsides and downsides. We protect what we can, but a downside of several small would be that it increases the amount of edge habitat. So here you can see edge habitat, and if this is all agricultural land, you're going to have edge habitat here. And we talked about how brown-headed cowbirds are more successful in this territory. And as we see the brown-headed cowbird more successful, we see declines in other bird populations because they're parasites to other birds. We can also see sumac trees. These outcompete other species because they are a live fast, die young species. They live in these edge habitats where there's lots of sun, and they can outcompete other tree species. And so we need to take these concepts into consideration as well. And our final concept is biosphere reserves. This is a concept that has been accepted internationally, and it was brought to us by United Nations Education of Scientific and Cultural Organizations. And when you have a plot of land that you want to preserve, there's going to be zones, or we can put them into specific zones to limit certain areas, the amount of human impact on certain areas. And so here you can see there's a transition zone, and in this transition zone all around, it is where you have human activity, you have homes, you have farming, you have logging. And as you go in here, there's a buffer zone, and in this buffer zone, you have less human impact. So these are your tourism places, your environmental education, your research. And then here, this is going to be your innermost area, your core area, that has the least amount of impact. And this is where the most preservation is going to occur. And so these are your biosphere reserves. And they are found, there's 610 in the world, worldwide as of 2013, and there's 47 in the United States. And a famous one of these is Big Bend National Park, which is found in Texas. And this is a beautiful part of the world that contains 1,000 plant species and about 400 bird species. And that is all we have. So these are things that we need to take into consideration when we are thinking about conserving and protecting biodiversity. Have a great day, and I'll see you later.